It was an unusually warm dawn in early September in the year of Marius and Aquilius, 99 BCE. Rome had already begun stirring with activity. Titus Veturius Cicurinus was already awake, anticipating the day ahead of him. His toga virilis was being whitened with chalk by his servants, a light breakfast was being prepared, and a small group of proletariat clients were gathering outside the gates of his domus. Today was no ordinary day. In the afternoon, the centuriate assembly would be called to the Field of Mars, a training field outside the city walls, to vote for the next year's consuls. Before we dive into the election, let's take a moment to imagine the day through the eyes of Titus Veturius. The Veturii family was an old patrician family, but not a powerful one. Because of his patrician status, we know that he was a citizen, and we will assume that he was able to vote in the assembly of the centuries. Let's imagine him as middle-aged, a veteran, as almost all male Roman patricians were, supplying his own armor and horse for the cause. Titus would have had some money, potentially some property besides his domus, but was not unfathomably wealthy. Let's assume Titus's eldest son was also fit for fighting and had fought in the legions these last few years. Finally, let's assume that Titus had never held any major elected office despite his patrician blood. Now, back to the day's events. Titus recalled that the preceding years had been politically tumultuous. Rome had faced 3 existential threats from Germanic and African kingdoms, all repulsed by a single man, the senior consul of this year, Gaius Marius. Gaius Marius had been elected an unprecedented and legally dubious 5 consecutive times, some of which were in absentia, which was almost certainly illegal, more than any other Roman before him. He would stand today, just months after celebrating a triumph for his victories, both hero of Rome and partially political pariah, for his 6th consecutive term. Today's candidate for consul, Gaius Marius, was not a patrician. He was a new man, a novus homo, a provincial whose family gained citizenship elsewhere in rural Italy. While an accomplished soldier and general himself, Gaius Marius was no friend to the patrician soldierly class. In his efforts to repel inland invasions and provincial pugilism, Marius expanded the Roman legions to outfit regular Roman citizens in state-funded arms and armor. Gone were the days where the legions were filled entirely with nobility and aristocracy, and gone were the days where loot and plunder was distributed only to the same. Likewise, Marius had brought some unintentional shame to the patrician class, as his tactical victories were in stark contrast to tremendous and spectacular military failures of his patrician consular colleagues. Titus Veturius recognized how crucial Gaius Marius' leadership was in saving Rome from her enemies. 5 times before had he, and much of Rome, elected Marius to serve again and again. The Senate and people rewarded Marius with triumphs and the unofficial title Third Founder of Rome. Yet this election felt different. During Marius' tenures as consecutive consul, he had formed a compact with a populist tribune of the plebs named Lucius Appuleius Saturninus. Saturninus sought Marius' political support in passing laws increasing the power of the tribuneship, essentially the political vehicle that the common people used to check the power of the Senate. And in return, Saturninus agreed to help settle Marius' war veterans on prosperous new land conquered on behalf of the state. Marius had agreed to this arrangement. He believed that settling his veterans in new provinces would cement Roman rule, and he also owed them one for fighting nonstop for years. This relationship, however, was not entirely to Marius' political benefit. It was no secret that Marius was handing out bribes to buy his 6th consulship, and untimely deaths of political opponents standing against him generated whispers of assassination. There were even rumors of a prophecy, told to Marius during his campaigns in Numidia, that he would be a consul a total of 7 times. A quick editor's note, the second, untold part of the prophecy said that there would be a greater Roman even than himself, but understandably, Marius kept that a secret. He did, however, have his suspicious eye on one candidate, his nephew, Gaius Julius Caesar. Concurrently, Saturninus found himself involved in an international row. Mithridates, a larger-than-life king of Pontus on the coast of the Black Sea, had sent an ambassador loaded with eastern gold to bribe the Senate to allow Mithridates to wrest control of the Anatolian peninsula from his neighbors. Many senators were willing to accept these bribes. Yet, Saturninus saw this as his opportunity to stick it to the nobility and expose this corruption publicly. However, rather than taking the high road, Saturninus resorted to insulting the Pontic ambassador personally, landing him in court for what was essentially considered treason. These rumors and political drama were tough to stomach for Titus Veturius. The obvious pressure for him to vote for Marius today must have been overwhelming, but the cracks were starting to show. Quintus Caecilius Metellus Numidicus, a leader in the traditional conservative community, had always opposed Marius and was engaged in outright political war with Saturninus. While Numidicus was censor, a very senior former consul responsible for officially managing the list of legal government officials, had attempted to expel Saturninus as a tribune of the plebs for his immoral political tactics. Numidicus was running for consul in opposition to Marius, and the contrast could not have been more clear. Numidicus was an established statesman, having been a consul and tribune of the plebs, and is the current censor. In the eyes of Titus Veturius, Numidicus must have seemed an establishment candidate that stood for political stability and, conversely, inflexibility. On the other hand stood Marius, a self-made man of sorts, risen to political power through sheer determination and force of will. To Titus, Marius was a symbol of rapid change, outpacing the Roman elite's ability to keep up. The only certainty of today was uncertainty. As Titus walked through the front door of his house, he noticed that his neighbor was doing the same, though their destinations were slightly different. A warm greeting between the two preceded an informal conversation about current affairs. As a plebeian merchant, Titus's neighbor might have made his money in the silver trade from further Spain. Marius inspired his neighbor, a plebeian like himself, finally ascending to such importance on the Roman stage. This bothered Titus, as he sees Marius as a catalyst for fracturing the republic that he and his family had fought, lived, and died for over generations. Titus also noticed that the gaggle of clients following his plebeian neighbor was slightly larger than his own. The neighbors parted ways as they exited the Pomerium, both the physical and religious boundary of the ancient city of Rome, and headed to the Field of Mars. The large, open, and sun-battered field was marked with stakes, identifying where each voting block should gather. Romans were distributed amongst these 193 blocks according to wealth and age. The most important blocks stood in front and voted first. 6 blocks reserved for patrician families, behind them the 12 blocks for the equitae, to which Titus's neighbor belonged. The equitae were extremely rich, often richer than the patricians standing ahead of them, but were simply not born to one of the historic families. 140 more blocks were divided amongst the 1st through 5th classes, normal Romans of varying economic means. 4 blocks were assigned to artists, and one large, in fact the largest, block contained the urban poor, the proletarii, those with no property, no means, not a denarii to their name. A single magistrate presided over the rules for today's voting. Each block, in rank order, cast their ballots to be tallied in front of a clerk. Once each block had cast their ballots, they were tallied internally to determine if there was a winning consensus. Once candidates received enough votes to be considered, the block would cast its single vote for the first and second candidates in front of the senior magistrate. While each block was weighted equally, the votes were cast in rank order, meaning that should patricians, equites, and the first class all agree on the next consuls, the election was decided before the poorer classes could even voice their opinion. The path to electoral victory looked a bit different than what we're used to today. The biggest difference lies in the fact that 2 consuls needed to be elected today. There were no protections against 2 candidates who were diametrically opposed to each other from being elected in the same year. That would result in tremendous gridlock, and it happened often. Additionally, while the absolute majority would determine a victor, all elections of the same type were held simultaneously, resulting in ranked choice voting, then first past the post voting, and finally runoffs should victors not immediately appear. In some cases, votes could take days. It's worth noting that other officials, like military officers and administrative positions, were elected via different voting bodies, structures, and rules, but we won't get into that here today. The sun was beating down on Titus's head as he stood amongst his peers in the open field. He could feel a bit of a sunburn developing on his bald spot. Finally, it was his turn to vote. He carried a wax tablet marked with the initials for Quintus Caecilius Metellus Numidicus, and deposited his tablet into a large urn or receptacle to be counted. A half hour later, his block had cast their ballots and submitted their vote to the senior magistrate. Gaius Marius had been chosen, and later elected the senior consul, with Lucius Valerius Flaccus as his junior. Numidicus would not serve as consul this year, and would soon enter into exile. Titus returned home with mixed emotions. Gaius Marius was a new man in bed with allies on the verge of committing treason, yet Titus distinctly remembered the feelings of respect he had for the man when Rome was facing an indomitable threat, having been grateful for his leadership. On January 1st, the inauguration of the year's new consuls began. Titus found himself walking again with his neighbor, this time to the Temple of Jupiter. The day was to be packed with ceremony. Gaius Marius and Lucius Valerius Flaccus began with the religious rites and auspices performed by the College of Pontiffs, sacrificing 2 oxen and taking a public oath to support and defend Rome from her enemies, and made promises to the gods. Thousands were in attendance to watch this unprecedented and historic moment. The audience, however, was largely silent. Only whispers could be heard as they watched the spectacle. Then the speeches began. Marius spoke with great authority on the state of the Republic. It was in need of strong leadership to strengthen its borders, to rid the ruling class of corruption and complacency, and he was the only man that could do it, a 5th time. Valerius Flaccus's speech mirrored Marius's, but was largely forgettable. Later in the day, the politicking would begin. Marius and Valerius Flaccus would enter the temple to begin their appointments. Who would personally control each province, each army, and who would be on their chief advising staff. The filling of these posts and the recruitment for the armies would take place in the next few weeks. Titus returned home in the afternoon with a great sense of unease. He thought to himself, what would Rome become should this man, Gaius Marius, continue to break all political norms and remain in power in perpetuity? Would this season of change come to an end anytime soon? As we look backward through Roman history, it's all too easy to interpret it as final set moments, leading inevitably toward the story we all know is coming. Yet for Romans like Titus, the future was anything but certain. The Republic had faced and overcome immense threats, but its path forward was filled with instability and ambition, shifting with each choice and new leadership. Even in moments that felt decisive, history teaches us that change is always possible, and that the outcomes we now see as inevitable were, to those living through them, anything but. Just as Rome's future was uncertain, so too is our understanding, a reminder that in both history and life, moments of seeming resolution often hold the seeds of unexpected transformation. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing for more Roman commentary. Also, check out the Commentary Romanum on Patreon, where you'll get early access to future videos and help support the channel. Vale, citizen, and I'll see you next time.